I'm Ashton from EventChain for Investment Pitch Media and FinTech News Network. And today on Blockchain Interviews, we have Gabriel Rene, founder and executive director of Versus. Gabe, thanks so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
I'd love to kick it off with a discussion about what is Versus and how is it making the world a better place through technology?
So I guess the short answer is that the World Wide Web really transformed the way that we communicate globally. It's also a public utility for the world. It's not owned by any one country or corporation, and yet all countries and all companies, individuals use it. The shortcoming of the web is that the information that we seek about the world, whether it's specific information on anything that you're looking at or interested in, maybe Googling it and searching for it, or whether it's instructions and DIY, how to perform a task in the world, that all happens behind screens. But with the birth of a new interface that's happening in Web 3.0 with augmented reality and holographic information, you can suddenly start to place information and instructions and even program physical activity, like in the same ways that we program actions that take place on websites, into the physical world itself. So like the original web protocol standards that we all rely on today, open standards like HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and HTML, we've invented Hyperspace Transaction Protocol. It's a way of taking that same sort of functionality and placing it into the world. The advantage of that is it actually creates a sort of underlying grammar that both humans and robots and machines and Internet of Things devices can all use to make sense of the world and share information together. The benefits of that are that you can then program activities in any sort of operational sense. We start to think about pickers locating things in a warehouse, or ships moving in and out of ports, or products moving between distribution points, or locating something in a retail space. You go to Home Depot and you want to find this exact thing in three-dimensional space. Suddenly everyone can use this underlying protocol technology to enable sort of digital information in the world in a way that's interoperable, like how we actually interact in the world today.
Wow, that's really fascinating, Gabriel. How did you get into this in the first place, and when did you first start Versus?
Well, the idea for Versus is several decades old. I started working in the early 90s at a R&D lab called CyberLab. And at the time, a lot of the science fiction stories that had come in the late 80s and early 90s were all about this idea of a sort of three-dimensional web, like what they used to call the metaverse. And a lot of really funky movies at the time around virtual reality, Lawnmower Man and Johnny Mnemonic and a few others. And we were working on some of the earliest versions of these technologies, working with Human Interface Technologies Labs at University of Washington, and getting a chance to really test some of the early prototypes. And as a young man, I could suddenly see that even as the web was emerging, it was eventually going to go 3D. So over a period of many decades working across e-commerce and working in immersive technologies, database architectures, and gaming, really started to see that combined with mobile technologies and networks to build this new sort of web in the world, which we call the spatial web. So we started Versus formally about 12 months ago. I think it was in R&D for a couple years before that. But the actual company is just under 12 months old now. So I would say 25 years of R&D and a year old.
That's amazing. And how far is the development of the spatial web right now? And is it already live in the market, or what's the timeline here?
Yeah, so the underlying protocols are in beta now. We have a handful of really large global partners that we've done some test integrations with and that are currently testing it. We will plan on deploying it sometime next year. We'll roll that out with the foundation, which will then host that, much like the World Wide Web Foundation today, and make that available for everybody. So We've already proven out the basic functionality, and it's working really nicely. So then we'll be relying on everyone to participate. We'll spin up working groups and start to test it for different markets, and then develop the standards over time with a number of people at the table.
Mm-hmm. And I also read that as the spatial web grows, you mentioned, for example, a picker could find something in a warehouse very easily in a three-dimensional space, but this really expands to a whole smart city of sorts. Do you foresee smart cities growing through Versus, and how would that work?
So I think actually the only way you can really have a smart city is if all the things that we call smart are able to interoperate, right? So right now we talk about smartphones and smart cars and smart contracts, potentially smart glasses, smart warehouses, smart smart utilities. There isn't going to be a version where Microsoft technology controls the port and the transportation is managed by Google and all the IoT devices are IBM plus 30 other companies. And Amazon controls all the automated transaction experiences. That's not a smart city. That's a highly fragmented city where with large companies controlling different parts that won't work together. So in our opinion, you cannot have a smart city unless you have something like Versus as your underlying digital infrastructure, an open structure that then allows all those parties and participants, along with startups and new companies and citizens and federal governments or local governments, to all participate together, much like the web today. So it's a difference between the sort of app ecosystems we're stuck in today with Apple and Android, or even the apps themselves, which are siloed experiences. The world is interoperable. It's fine if you want to have that behind a little screen, but when it becomes active in the world, the ports and the airports and the cars and the streets and the drones and our shopping experiences and entertainment and safety and utilities and energy actually all need to work together. So we think this is the basis for a universal digital infrastructure that allows everyone else to develop on top of it in an open and free model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great ideology. And one thing that I think of when I think of 3D dimensional spaces, and that's been popular recently, is digital assets inside of virtual spaces and also the marketplaces for those assets. Do you foresee some integrations with virtual assets inside of the spatial web, and would there be a marketplace for that, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, great question. I think there's two distinct classes of virtual assets. So in one respect, everything in the world will have its own sort of virtual asset, almost like a digital twin that's often used in the Industry 4.0 narrative that's tied to it. It's as if everything has sort of a holographic representation of it where all the information about that thing is embedded. So all the Wikipedia information, all the history, all the usage, all the rules around how you can use something or buy something, it's all sort of embedded in the sort of holographic digital representation that is then synced with respect to data and then linked to that object. And this is where blockchain becomes valuable because the data integrity around these things becomes important. So that could be for anything or ultimately maybe for everything. And then there is what you might consider pure virtual assets. These could be characters, it could be information, it could be experiences that are layers in the world. Every game, every movie, every bit of sort of storytelling, intellectual property suddenly becoming interactive and available to experience in the physical world in augmented reality or completely new worlds in virtual reality. So I think that the largest asset class in human history will end up being virtual assets. There'll be these sort of different classes of them within that, some that are very specifically tied as representations of something happening in the real world, and others that are purely really our ideas and fictions and fantasies that we get to explore. With blockchain and the idea of turning these into smart assets, there may be one-of-a-kind representations. There could be only one version of the Mark II Iron Man suit that's a virtual experience that you can step into, and that may end up being incredibly expensive. So, creating digital scarcity is something that blockchain enabled. We had digital abundance, but that really drove the price of digital things to zero. So with digital scarcity, the ability to create a unique identifier for an object and essentially protect that on the chain adding sort of data integrity around it, you're going to have an asset class that I believe will boost the global economy by a significant factor. I mean, if you look at the beginning of digital transformation in the 1950s to today, we almost have 10x the global economy, from about $10 trillion to almost 100 trillion today. So you can only imagine what the accelerated path of these technologies might do over the next few decades. And I don't think that it's too crazy to say that we might 10x again within the next 40 or 50 years.
I'm really glad that you touched on blockchain there with the virtual assets as well, because there will need to be some enforcement of digital scarcity, and there really has been a sort of devaluation with digital abundance when you can just duplicate things and you can't really create unique scarce items in the spatial web. So with Versus, are you guys integrating that blockchain scarcity from the get-go, and how will that work, and have you already been working on that?
Yeah, so there's two components there. One is that we're working with what's called decentralized identifiers, DIDs, and think of them almost as the new URL. URLs are pretty cool because in one sense they're an identity, right? Amazon.com, and they're an address. So what we want is to take the sort of format, the idea of the most widely adopted identifier in the world, which is the URL, and then apply that to objects, whether it's real world objects or sort of digital assets. And so those assets themselves can then be registered on any blockchain. So with Versus, we are setting up the HSTP protocol to be able to be cross-ledger, because I don't think that any of us are entirely bought into the fact that there'll be somehow the blockchain. We know that that's not a real thing. At the same time, there's DAGs and graphs and tangles and who knows what's quantum ledgers, who knows what's next. So the important idea there is the data integrity, and whether that's a combination of cryptography or sort of human and social consensus algorithms, incentives that are really social hacks to make sure people are telling the truth. We want to be able to support those in any way. So we see that almost as the same way that the World Wide Web did not have a one particular approach to data storage. So that here's, as long as you can store data anywhere you like. You can store it, on your buddy's server in his basement, or you can spend, $100,000 and store it on Akamai, and now we have AWS. We want to be agnostic with respect to the sort of data integrity layer and which ledgers are communicating. So we have ways of using DIDs to enable cross-ledger functionality, which hopefully will make it future-proof.
I'm really glad that you've taken that approach, and I completely agree that you need to have that blockchain interoperability and that cross-chain transferability of assets, because you just don't know, and you need to future-proof yourself, because the blockchains today may not be the blockchains of tomorrow, and that's the same with every progression and evolution, as we saw from MySpace to Facebook and whatever comes after that, right? And to always be prepped for the future. So that's really great that you've taken that approach. One thing that I recently saw from Versus is that you released the Spatial Web Book that you've written, and you're developing that into the Versus ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about the book release and how that fits in?
Yes, I think whereas Versus is really an organization that's focused on the development and support of the underlying technologies, and as well as the commercialization and adoption of them, the larger narrative is really about the spatial web. And what we wanted to do was put all of our thoughts about the world and the impact that artificial intelligence and spatial computing and blockchains, cryptocurrencies, Internet of Things, and other exponential technologies are going to have on the world. If the last 150 years is any indication, our definition of progress as a society includes amazing technological advances as a civilization. At the same time, these technologies have brought us to the brink of potential destruction, and the impacts on climate change and other issues, even with respect to our social fabric, are problematic. So we think that with these new technologies, which are exponentially more powerful than the last century, it's really critical to make sure that we lay down some ethical foundations, that we have a conversation about how we want to use these technologies in advance. use them to hopefully reverse the tide of some of the challenges that we've faced and currently face today with respect to our usage of technologies to date, and pave the road for what we hope might be the opportunity for a global civilization that works together as a single sort of network. And so the book really outlines that narrative. It goes into some of the promises and, as Ray Kurzweil always likes to say, the pitfalls around these technologies. But really importantly, it describes how the protocol itself becomes a connective tissue to create a sort of digital nervous system that really could help us address a lot of the questions and challenges we have around sustainability, around privacy, around identity, around security and trust. And so it's available on Amazon starting September 2nd. And we have some really wonderful quotes from some market leaders, and we've been getting great feedback, sort of as I mentioned to you before the call here, from industry leaders around the world. So we're very much looking forward to putting this out here as a way of boosting the visibility and starting the conversation, so we can start to weave this into our businesses, into our governance structures, into our education models, into our design theses, and into our everyday lives.
That's really great. I'm looking forward to seeing that release on Amazon, and I will put a link in the description below when the book is available on Amazon for the viewers. And that's all the time that we have for the interview. But how can people learn more about Versus or get involved and, of course, follow along as you guys progress?
If you are interested, please come visit us at versus.io. And after the book launch, you can also come to the spatialweb.org to learn more.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabriel. It's been a pleasure. Let's follow up in the near future.
Looking forward to it, Ashton. Thank you so much.